NVTC Legislative and Policy Committee. And just to be cognizant of everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to note that we're meeting at 6:07 p.m. And today's meeting is an all virtual public meeting as permitted under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act and NVT's electronic participation policy. The meeting is being streamed live via NVTC's YouTube account. If the live stream transmission fails, we would ask anyone watching to email support@novatransit.org. NVTC staff are monitoring this account throughout the meeting. And I'd now like to ask Director Matthijs if she wouldn't mind calling the roll for ensuring that we have a quorum for tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So please respond here when you hear your name. Chair Aguirre.
Present.
Ms. Garvey.
Hi, Dave Snyder. Dave Snyder on
Wonderful.
by phone. I hope to join visually here shortly, but I thought I'd do everybody a favor by just being on by audio.
I appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Dave.
That makes you present. I will count you towards quorum, sir. And again, Mr. Walkinshaw.
I'm here.
Fantastic. Ms. Reed.
Here.
Fantastic. So indeed, we do have quorum.
And I'm here as well.
And of course, Senator Evan, and thank you. See what happens when I do things out of alphabetical order. So thank you so much.
Sure.
So indeed, we do have quorum, and I'm just going to identify some of the key staff who are joining us on the call, who are going to be presenting tonight. And so obviously, this is Kate Matthijs, the Executive Director. We have two of our Senior Program Managers, Anne McGrain and Andrew DeBetter. And then also from Commonwealth Strategy Group, we have our Legislative Liaison, Amy Perrin-Seibert. We do have some other staff on the line who are here with technical support. And so I now can turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Matthijs. And the first item we have on the agenda is the September 29th, 2022 NVTC Legislative and Policy Committee meeting summary. Are there any questions, comments, concerns about those the meeting summary from September 2022? All right, hearing none, we'll move on to agenda item number 2, the General Assembly update from our legislative liaison, Ms. Perrin-Seibert.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I will apologize. I was telling Kate earlier, I'm having some internet issues. Our stuff got kind of knocked out by a storm down here last night. So if I break up, let me know, or I'll hopefully just be able to kind of log right back in. But I'm going to try to be brief anyways, because I think the rest of the agenda is kind of the important part. I gave mostly my update at the NVTC meeting, just 2 weeks ago. Nothing really has changed at this point, and at least in Northern Virginia, it hasn't. So, obviously elections are the thing on everybody's mind the most, and what's happening. And so obviously the big stuff we have is the June 20th primary. And so once we get through that, we'll know a whole lot more about what our Northern Virginia delegation will look like, at least in the Senate. So that's a huge piece for us, I think. And obviously Senator Evan knows this as well. I mean, we've got a lot of incumbents who have challenges, and those are the folks that really have been in the thick of it with us and know quite a bit about our issues. And so I think that's the most concerning part for us. We've lost quite a bit of institutional knowledge, especially when it comes to Metro and VRE and NVTC issues.
I think we lost Amy.
Yeah, she froze on my screen.
So I'll apologize now for being late. I'm sorry, I was a little late, and then new devices and
It's okay. You're here with us, Ms. Garvey.
Thank you, Kanik.
Institutional knowledge, because I think that's the part that I'm the most worried about as your lobbyist is that piece. And obviously we'll all be taking some time to educate
Amy,
folks.
You froze for a moment. So we heard you say that you were concerned about losing people from Northern Virginia potentially in this election season, and then you came back when you said institutional knowledge.
No, great. Okay, that's not great. But okay, so I said that we were losing. Obviously, we have a lot of folks who have primaries. We hope we don't lose anybody. I think was the piece that I was talking about, because that's a lot of folks who have worked with us over the years. Senator Barker, Senator Marsden, Senator McPike, who have really big primaries, obviously, June 20th. And then obviously the people that we've lost from an institutional knowledge standpoint are Senator Saslaw, Senator Howell, as well as Eileen Filler-Korn, who in the past have carried our bills. They have carried the sort of the Metro big bills and any of our transit funding bills. So what I was saying is that we're grateful that we have you because you're on all those committees now, and can be there and help us with that piece. But we have a lot of education to do. I think that's going to be our biggest challenge this summer and the fall, is just, me and Kate going around and meeting people and talking to folks and sort of having that mess.
There she goes again. Are we still planning to do this, bringing people up and giving them a tour and riding on Metro, educating, having a little show and tell for legislators?
I think we're going to wait until after the election.
Oh, that's what I meant. But it's sounding like we should do that in the fall.
Well, it'll be hard to do it for the new people who won't have taken office yet, and we won't know their committee assignments. But for people who've been around.
Yeah, I meant waiting till after the November election.
Yeah, so maybe you have to wait till the next year. I don't know. I think Senator Barker was talking about doing it for the Finance Committee, right?
Oh, great. If the Finance Committee retreat is up in Northern Virginia, that would be a good time to do it or something.
Isn't that what he said, Kate? Do you remember?
So there was interest in circling that. Some of the challenges of the Finance Committee, the key staff that we've been working with for years has now moved into the administration. So there are a lot of staffing changes. If I recall at our last conversation, Senator Evan, you were recommending we do something in the spring after everybody's seated, sort of after session would be an appropriate time to be doing a tour. Linking, it's good to see Amy back, linking it with existing committee activities does help in terms of getting members up here in the DC area, per diem and other things that kind of go along with making that a beneficial setup for them. So that is, having a tour and things like that are something that we definitely could be looking at in the springtime. And I know that was based upon Senator Evan, your guidance, the timing.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be able to get all the players. The fall, if the Senate Finance Committee is meeting up here in the fall, and I don't recall if we are, that would be good. But the timing of us when we have the joint finance or full Senate Finance Committee retreat, and all the senators come, that would be just the Senate, but you won't get as much time to do like a whole day long tour of the meeting, because the meeting's only a day and a half.
I think that's what Senator Barker was talking about doing it then, but I don't know. Maybe we
there might be a chance to do something with them this fall if they're up here. But
that's what I mean. But like do something light.
But I think we should plan ahead for the spring or summer for a complete, more comprehensive tour for whether it's the Joint Committee on Transportation Accountability or a Finance Committee or whatever. But just start the preparation for that.
Yeah, but wouldn't it make sense, Adam, if they're all up here anyway, to do something? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's just a matter of what we can do. When we did a tour last time, it was really comprehensive, maybe even more than was needed. But it's just a matter of how much time we need to show people and get the message out,
Okay, all right.
And I think also, Libby, it's going to depend on, capacity for staff and how much we have prepared ahead of time.
Right. So that's why I was thinking something light, maybe not a big heavy duty something. Maybe, as I say, maybe, we put on a dinner somewhere and we invite them to dinner and they come to dinner, and some of them have to come by car and some of them have to come by Metro, and we see who gets there first.
No, we'll just stick everybody on a scooter.
Well, there's that too.
But
anyway,
we
just
do
a thought.
have,
although if they get there first by car, it would not be good.
Right. We do have Amy back. Amy, you feeling good about your connection? I think she might have frozen again.
Yeah. But we're going to have her intermittently, obviously, over the course of this meeting. So.
Okay. Kate, thoughts? Should we go ahead and Amy, I think we might have you back.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm back. I keep feeling like I'm back, and then I realize everybody's frozen, which is the worst. I'm like listening, and then all of a sudden everybody's frozen. But I'm sorry. Did you ask me a question? I'm happy to answer it.
No, you have anything else for your report?
No, I don't actually. That's it. I mean, I think that's really that's our focus. It's going to be elections, and then obviously all the piece about getting all the materials together. I think what everybody's just talked about earlier is exactly what we want to do: is spend the summer getting our sort of ducks in a row, really kind of identifying what issues we're going to have for next year and getting all that stuff together. We've got a little time to do that, and I think we should definitely take it.
Absolutely. Any questions from commissioners?
So this is Dave. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of issues next year. We always do. But what's the strategy for the metro operating deficit? And when I listen to this discussion, I'm like half and half. You bring people up here, you give them a dinner, even if you show them all the economic development, they just get jealous and they say, well, why should we help you do more of that when we need some of that where we are? So what's the psychology here that can start to prepare for the
I
state
think,
stepping forward and doing what it should? So that's a question
Yeah.
I have, and I apologize if it's out of line.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Evan.
I don't think it's out of line at all, Dave. I think it's important. We did a study at one point, the economic impact or economic value of Metro. And I think we have to be very clear in drawing the lines that this many Metro trips, is this many cars off the job, is this much tax dollars to the Commonwealth, and what it brings to the Commonwealth in terms of jobs and tax dollars, tax revenue from income tax or business tax or all kinds of revenue. And I think that you're I think posing the question is important because people do get concerned, like you got Amazon or this or that, but I think it's important that we show what that in turn brings to the state.
Mr. Snyder, did you have another question on that?
I agree, and we've done that. We're doing that work, and it's great work. But a lot of people aren't influenced by numbers. You know, it's like how do we make the case in a way that's real? The number of police officers that can't be hired for local jurisdictions.
I mean, I think we can include some of that.
Paid.
I think we can include some of that, Mr. Snyder, but I think that's the importance of bringing folks up here to, number one, I want to put people in traffic. I want them to see what it's like at rush hour, you know, at 5 o'clock, at 4 o'clock. I'm assuming they're not going to be here for the morning rush hour, right? But if they're driving up and they see the morning rush hour, I think some of those things are very evident. And to see how many people are traveling on the Metro, I think that's going to be important too. But I think we're relying on staff to put together a comprehensive kind of experience for them to be able to see what is really happening. So to your point, to really be in the nitty gritty of it all and get that experience and see, you know, what is the need for it, and not necessarily to make them jealous or to say, hey, we need this down here too. And I'm not arguing that they don't, because I'm encouraging public transit across the entire Commonwealth, of course, but there are realities in other parts of the Commonwealth that they have to deal with as well. But Ms. Garvey has her hand up. I wanted to give her a chance to make a comment.
I'm trying to not be out of line because Dave apologized and I've been out of line since I got on. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm trying to raise my hand. Couple of thoughts. I think Senator Emmett Hanger is a friend, at least as far as the concept of Northern Virginia supporting the whole state, because I was with him at one point and he was handing out these maps. I don't know if you were at that session, Adam, and it was showing how much of the money for the state came from Northern Virginia and how much the whole state depended on us. So I assume he would be there for Senate Finance, right?
Yes.
So it seems like he's helpful. He might have some ideas on how to present things, possibly. I mean, I just say it because I'm comfortable with him, and I assume he's knows his colleagues pretty well. So that's a thought. And then maybe they'd be interested in having some executives from Amazon and Virginia Tech or something come and just talk to them a little bit about what Metro means to the region. So they don't hear it from our staff, but they hear it from the business
Testimonials.
Yeah.
I think, Libby, you got the point. Also, Dave, another thing we can do when I say quantify it and you talk about numbers, you can put the numbers into perspective by saying this, you know, many millions of dollars come from taxes that in turn are 40% of the Commonwealth school budget or whatever it is that they'll relate to. But I'd be happy to work with Dave and Libby or whoever on just kind of going over when there's an outline of the messaging and the potential opportunities for what we might take people to see or do, you know, as things get closer.
And just to check with staff, you all have some notes on this, right? What the conversation is going along on.
And my hands up, I volunteer to work. I'm happy to work with Adam and Dave or whoever. I would be happy to work on this.
So I absolutely, and I'm actually very looking forward to, we have a number of really good presentations this evening that I hope will speak to this messaging. We've actually done some updated studies. So that's actually part of our agenda tonight to talk about that and those messaging. We do have also our colleagues at WMATA are planning several tours and things like that. So just there's a couple of different opportunities that we'll be able to take advantage of. And I think the tough thing, just getting back to something that Amy was sharing, I know she's got some internet challenges, is that some of those legislators, including Senator Hanger, are retiring. So
Is he retiring? Oh.
Yes.
So part of the dynamic is also who's in that we're really going to know by November. And that's really why the timing is going to be important after we know the new set of players. I was going to mention it later, but I'll mention it now. We do plan at a very extensive education, including, we do have our December legislative event. And that one is probably going to be a little bit more 101 about the importance of transit to the Commonwealth than we may have done previously, because we expect we're going to have a number of new legislators. So we're tracking that very closely. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I do know we have some fantastic presentations that I think will be feeding into some of these questions that folks have opening this meeting.
No, I agree. And I was going to say, this is actually probably a good segue into our next agenda item. And if there's no burning questions, I'm going to move us to the next item. So we're going to hear from our Senior Program Manager, Ms. Anne McGrain, who will present the findings from the Value of Northern Virginia's Transit Network to the Commonwealth study. As you know, our 2017 findings in this area were instrumental to making the case for the dedicated capital funding for WMATA. And we know that this year's report may also be influential in future revenue discussions. So, Ms. McGrain, I'm going to throw this over to you so you could run us through this next presentation.
Very much, and good evening, everyone. So as mentioned, I'm presenting the findings of our Value of Northern Virginia's Transit Network to the Commonwealth study, which from this point on, I'll just refer to as the Value of Transit study. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this study is to quantify the value of Northern Virginia's transit network to the Commonwealth. And I think as this previous conversation has shown, I think most people who live or work here really understand the value that our transit system brings in terms of job access and economic activity. But equally important is that aspect of understanding transit's value to the Commonwealth in terms of income and sales tax revenue sent to Richmond. And so one of the key things that we've been looking to is, as these conversations in the future about funding transit happen, we want to have that return on investment piece that can help inform and shape the narrative on the importance of transit, both regionally for us and then of course statewide. Next slide, please. So what did we find? For our analysis year of 2025, Northern Virginia's transit network generates about $1.5 billion in income and sales tax revenue to the Commonwealth. And one thing we have been asked previously is, what portion of this is Metro Rail? And I can't give you an exact number just because of how our methodology works, but we estimate that at least 1 billion of that amount is really attributed to Metro Rail. And throughout this presentation, I try to pull out other key things that we can attribute to Metro Rail just to help with that specific conversation as well. But so within that, large $1.5 billion number, I'm sure a number of you remember the 2017-2018 report in which we calculated the value of transit as 600 million. And so I want to note just the methodological differences that kind of lead to this much greater increase in the value of transit. And so the first thing is that we did in this analysis include the local and regional bus systems in addition to looking at Metro Rail and VRE. And this was really because we consider our transit system as an interconnected network. And so we wanted to make sure we captured all of the benefits that transit leads to. I mean, I think a lot of, how, people will often take buses to catch Metro Rail or vice versa. And so removing one kind of has impacts on the other. So it's easier. It's kind of a more complete picture to look at that whole picture. And then we also chose an analysis year of 2025. And so this is different from the previous study in that we just have the increased years of growth and development from the Silver Line, from Amazon's new headquarters, but also by choosing the year of 2025, we've moved ourselves a little further away from the immediate impacts of COVID. So within our methodology, we looked at kind of current travel behaviors and changes now and made sure that our model was matching that in the current period before then forecasting forward into the 2025 period. And then finally, the kind of largest methodological change is that we considered what are known as total employment impacts instead of just the direct employment impacts. And I'll cover in more detail a little later in the presentation what that means, but you can see from this graphic on the right side of the screen that indirect and induced impacts do make up a large proportion of that $1.5 billion. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to just back up a little bit and describe the methodology that got us to that $1.5 billion number. So what we did was we compared a status quo 2025 travel modeling scenario to a scenario where we removed the transit network completely from Northern Virginia. And so when we did that, what we found was that vehicle travel or vehicle miles traveled increased by about 6%, but vehicle hours of delay or congestion increased by 64% in the no transit scenario. These maps on the right basically show the increase in the percentage increase in vehicle trips during the morning commute period. So trip starts are the origins, which in this case are often people's houses. And you can see how there's an increase kind of across the region. And it's a little more spread out than the very pinpointed increase that's in the destinations. And you can kind of look at that destinations map and see our employment centers pop, because if there isn't transit, you're going to have a dramatically increased number of vehicle trips in those areas. But I think it's also important to just note that, there's a pretty large difference between the vehicle miles or, vehicle travel and then that vehicle hours delay or congestion piece. And so what's happening is that the same trips are taking longer than they used to. And this often then leads to kind of people's radius of travel starting to diminish. You're not going to take that longer trip because it takes so much longer to get there than it did previously. Next slide, please. So, the traffic impacts are noticeable on the roadways, but they're even more noticeable when you start to look at bridge crossings between Virginia and DC or Maryland. The map on the right is, I think, supposed to be a little overwhelming just because what it's doing is showing the increase in daily bridge volumes in 2025 in a scenario without transit. So each car on this graphic represents about 5,000 vehicles. And the gray cars are the vehicles in that 2025 base scenario. And then the red cars are the increase that would occur in a no transit scenario. And then the percentage increase is, of course, that percentage change in the daily volume of the bridges. Then what this really does is it helps show the magnitude of the change. So again, as we were kind of chatting about bringing people up to witness the traffic, I think a lot of us know that, sometimes on a good day, it can be a challenge to get across some of these bridges. But in a no transit scenario, you kind of start to see how the entire metro region might become fragmented as people choose to work or shop or do other things much closer to home, just because it's so difficult to get across the Potomac River. Then the statistic on the left focuses really on the peak period of travel, so typical commuting times. And during those peak periods, the congestion levels across Memorial, Roosevelt, and Wilson bridges would require 2 additional travel lanes, and 14th Street the 14th Street Bridge would require 3 additional travel lanes if we wanted to try to build our way out of congestion. Of course, this is a bit more of a thought exercise than a recommendation, given that, induced demand and, the ability of the DC road network to handle increased traffic, is who knows how it would handle that. But really what I'm hoping this does is demonstrate the scale of the problem that having no transit creates. Next slide, please. So with those travel impacts and kind of how they're changing how people move through the region, the next step in the process was to look at employment and then also households, because the reality is that in the new kind of no transit scenario that we analyzed, the road network alone was not sufficient to handle all the vehicular traffic in the region. And so the next step in the process is to remove those employment centers or households to basically alleviate stress in the most highly congested areas. And so that process initially resulted in 157,000 jobs that could no longer be accommodated in Northern Virginia due to roadway congestion levels. And this is what's considered the direct impact on employment. So the map on the right shows the 157,000 jobs that are removed, kind of the density of where that decrease has to happen. About 76% of the jobs lost are within a half mile of a metro station. And really, if you look at the dark green segments of this map, what you can kind of start to see is where metro lines would be in that scenario. And, you know, this makes sense, right? Northern Virginia has done a lot of work in recent decades creating transit-oriented developments. And so when you remove that transit, it makes it very hard to get to those transit-oriented developments. And then finally, something I want to point out, and also just note that this is described in much more detail in our technical report, is that lower income households really were shown to bear a disproportionate impact in a no transit scenario. So for example, lower income households were about 17% of the labor force, but would represent over 33% of the job losses as we start to remove employment from the region to kind of make the transportation network work. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that I was going to describe the difference between indirect induced and direct employment impacts. And so this is a really key difference compared to what we did in the previous study. So the direct impact, as I mentioned on the other slide, is those jobs that are lost when transit no longer exists. So basically they're the jobs that are directly, that can be in Northern Virginia because we have a transit network. But what happens, and I think we all intuitively understand this, is that, you know, job losses in one area often have a cascading effect to job losses elsewhere. And so in this case, the indirect impact is kind of to all of those firms that might provide goods and services to the directly impacted organizations. So if you have attorneys or accountants, or even, you know, an office supply store delivering printer paper, they might need to either reduce their headcounts or, you know, go out of business entirely if kind of most of the firms they serve are in that direct impact segment. And then finally, that leads to induced impact, and that's basically workers who are no longer earning wages due to either losses in direct or indirect impact, then don't go and spend their wages on a work coffee or lunch. And so all told, the impacts to that original 157,000 jobs leads to a total employment impact of 311,000 jobs. And that is with about 270,000 of them are in Northern Virginia, and then the remainder, so a little over 40,000 are in the rest of Virginia. So that kind of gives the fuller picture of job loss that will occur. Next slide, please. And then the other side of that coin is households. So we also had to reduce households kind of to make the model work and make the people successfully be able to travel throughout the region. And so in the map on the right, you can probably see that there isn't as strong of a connection in where reductions happen in the number of households compared to metro stations. We calculated that about 42% of households lost are within a half a mile of a metro station. But again, this kind of makes sense. Many commuters, you know, use park and ride lots or take buses to reach their local metro stops. And then it's at their employment location that they're more often to be within walking distance of a station. But so this drop in 128,000 households is about 13% of the housing stock in the Northern Virginia area. So still, you know, a key amount and many people who we can support with transit and cannot support in a no transit scenario. Next slide, please. So, while the main purpose of this study is really to arrive at that $1.5 billion number, one thing we were able to do with all of that traffic analysis was to calculate impacts to residents and workers in Northern Virginia using benefit cost analysis methodology. And so we have gotten stats that really look at quality of life and cost of living issues that I think are very important to us in the region. And so again, we have a lot more details in our full technical report, which will be released right after the June Commission meeting. But I just wanted to point out that we have these user environmental costs and their breakdowns by jurisdiction. But this slide shows kind of some top line findings. So beyond the employment and household statistics, transit saves commuters $246 million in vehicle operating costs, avoids 150,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions, and avoids over 400 serious injuries. And this is really, again, that issue of there are longer trips, more trips. And so people are, there's increased exposure to serious crashes. There are added fuel and maintenance costs to maintaining a vehicle. And then of course, all of those idling vehicles will introduce more emissions into the air. Next slide, please. So getting back to that question of why is this important? So I noted at the beginning, transit is a vital part of Northern Virginia, but this study also proves that it provides substantial benefits to the Commonwealth. The $1.5 billion number would be about 5% of Virginia's total revenue. And we also took draft fiscal year 24 amounts to calculate a return on investment for the Commonwealth. So that is that Virginia receives 160% return on investment, so that for every dollar it gives to Northern Virginia to fund transit, it gets that dollar in return, that original dollar, plus an additional $1.60. So it's really a great investment. So over the past 50 years, our region has developed and grown in a way that really relies on transit, and it's why we can support the density we have. So hopefully these results help show that transit is a key component in our region's success. There's also just the point that transit helps alleviate traffic on our roadways, and particularly our interstate roadways. What we saw in that no transit scenario kind of represents a breakdown and fragmentation of the region, because our roadways become unreliable and bridges become nearly impassable. So by having people on transit, we also ensure that people and goods that rely on our interstate networks can reliably get to where they need to go. But of course, this requires funding that's stable and sustainable. And so we see these findings as kind of critical inputs in our future conversations about the importance of funding transit. So with that, I will open it up to questions. I am done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McGrain. Any questions? Ms. Garvey, I'm not sure if your hand's still up or.
I just put it up.
All right, go right
So
ahead.
this is great. I now have and I don't even know if I meant to, I now have my head totally in trying to convince people that they ought to fund us, right? They ought to fund transit. So that's where my head is. We're looking at this. Is there a way to, and all this information is great. Is there a way to hire a firm to put this into a cartoon format that shows, for example, all of the cars backing up at the bridge? And in fact, even if you put those lanes over, when they get across the bridge to District of DC, there's still the same number of lanes. I mean, it's a funnel, right? Is there a way to show that? Is there a way to show all of the employees you hire the employees and they come to work, and then show how they go, they get their nails done, they go and get a snack, they have something to eat, whatever, and all of that. I'm just thinking of a cute graphic that actually does this in kind of a cartoon format that I think would make it more real to people. I mean, a lot of people are not wonky academics, particularly people who don't live in Northern Virginia. And these numbers in the state, they're going to glaze over. And actually, I think it's even more huge than it is, at least for me here in Arlington. If you think about 45% of the jobs within a mile of metro station, And I also think just showing how it connects maybe to transit up and down the East Coast. And I actually think there's more effect than is even in this report. But I know you have to prove it with stuff. So I will stop talking. I think if there's a way of doing that, I think it would be expensive, but I think it would be really effective for people who have no clue and don't really particularly want to pay attention to a wonky report because they don't trust us wonky people, because what do we know?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Ms. Garvey. I think infographics are really impactful. And even though you have that infographic with the cars and the bridges, and you have like the little red cars showing what it would be like without transit, it's not necessarily as impactful as showing, well, now everybody's stuck on the bridge, right? So
And all
while
the
I
cars
like that,
back up, yeah.
yeah. So while I like the graphic, I think there's maybe a little bit more we can do that to just, as much as I hate to say it, like people don't necessarily want to read reports. You know, some people will.
Not
Don't get me
many.
wrong.
And they
But
all
not-
live in
but-
Northern
but not
Virginia,
many.
Canik.
Right. So I think that is a good point. But I know Mr. Eben has his hand up. So please, Mr. Eben, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to second what Commissioner Garvey was saying, and say as much as we can put things into Virginia terms, like that's the equivalent of a lane backed up from Richmond to Fredericksburg, or from Arlington to Richmond. That's how many cars would be off the road, that sort of thing. Whatever, or that's as many people as live in the Roanoke Valley, or what, whatever it is, just to translate it into Virginia. It doesn't even have to be Northern Virginia. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I really like that, because I mean, it's almost like if you say, well, it's the whole population of Roanoke is on the road at the same time or
Right.
something,
Sitting, right. And most people here are too young to remember, but Ronald Reagan got real big on David will remember, when he was trying to scare people about the deficit with Republicans. It hadn't happened too much. Then he talked about dollar bills stacked end to end, something to the moon and back, or some crazy.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's when people said, oh my God. I mean, they'd seen the numbers or whatever. It wasn't until his picture was painted that everybody suddenly saw it, if you will. So I think that's where I'm coming from.
Mr. Snyder, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just to follow up, we might also illustrate what the loss of dollars means in concrete terms to the state, not just dollars. How many teachers can't you hire? How many police officers? In other words, do a simple, here's the average salary of a police officer, average salary of a teacher. What does this equate into number of teachers that can't be hired? I think what we're struggling with is this is real to us, but we're dealing with people almost that speak a foreign language and have a different worldview. So how do we bridge that? But I will say this is a fantastic study, and great job on the part of Kate and Ann and everybody involved. You've added significantly to the analysis. Now I think it's, how do we make it real in Northern Virginia, and how do we make it real to people in the rest of the state?
Yeah, I totally agree with Mr. Eben and Mr. Snyder. How do we translate into Virginia lingo, if you will, right? So how many state troopers does that mean we can't hire? How many less
number of teachers? I would take it even a step further, say the number of teachers, and say, and that's as many teachers as in the entire Norfolk school system, or whatever it is, or as much that's all the state aid that Norfolk and Virginia Beach get combined, or something.
Yeah, you're coming in and out a little bit, Senator Eben, but we did hear you. Ms. Garvey, did you want to jump back in? You're on mute.
I did, and then I had another idea, and Adam, Senator Eben, pushed it out of my head. It was something else to make it more real to people. Oh, I know. Back to my idea about having the business leaders come in, chamber. I mean, having somebody from businesses, because Amazon would not be in Arlington if we did not have Metro. It wouldn't be in Northern Virginia. I mean, it was a huge selling point to bring them. And then Amazon brings, there are all of these things that happen. And that's not even, and no offense, because this report has to be, you can't, I know you have to be, with statistics and not use imagination. But if these companies, it wasn't here, we'd start to lose companies. I mean, and they wouldn't be coming. We'd be in a whole lot more trouble even than this report shows. And So yeah, there you go.
And I'd
Business,
say the
get
same.
business leaders in. Sorry.
Yeah, and I'd say the same thing for Virginia Tech, why we have Virginia Tech here, and the potential that we're going to have building out on our corridor to meet up with Amazon. Mayor Reed, I see your hand up.
So all of these are fantastic ideas, and it speaks to the fact that transportation is part of an ecosystem. And when we pull all these statistics out and make transportation something apart from how we work and how we get education and healthcare and how we are consumers, it's an ecosystem. And the transportation is the thread that ties our economy together. So I think we're all like talking about different aspects of trying to show the same thing, to do something concrete that makes it real for people outside Northern Virginia that do not participate in this kind of mass transit. But it's part of our ecosystem here. You can't simply take this away and expect us to continue living the way we live. And how do we help other people understand that it's all tied together?
Absolutely agreed. Ecosystem is a great word to use to tie it all together. Go ahead, Ms. Garvey.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And it reminds me of, which I've mentioned sometimes before, a video of New York from above at night. And it's got the red lights and the headlights so that you can see the cars. And then they stop at stoplights and it goes like this, pulses. And I'm thinking, oh my God, it's a circulatory. So it looks like blood corpuscles circulating through the city. And that's what it is. This is our circulatory system. And the metro is the beating heart of it. You can take out metro, you lose your blood. I mean, you lose all your blood pressure, you collapse. And I think to the point that, yeah, Catherine's saying it's a system of a whole. It's a whole lot more than just transportation. We cannot live like this if we don't have transportation. And if we can't live like this, it's not going to be good for the rest of the state.
Lots of great comments. Anything else before we let Ms. McGrain off the hook here?
Are we getting a copy of this emailed to us, a draft of this study?
So,
Go ahead, Ms. Mattice.
so in fact, the report and another presentation of this will be actually at our June commission meeting. So part of the reason this is fantastic is we want to hear back from all of you how we present this information. And so the report's being finalized right now, will be included as a part of what happens at our June meeting. Probably the full report, which has lots of technical stuff, will probably be within 24 hours of that meeting. But you will have all the materials. We'll also make sure that you have the links to this presentation that we put out tonight. But I do appreciate all the comments. This is something that we have been talking about at staff, is how we can present it. So this is perfect in real time. The other thing I'd like to do, Mr. Chair, is circle back to our communications team. We do have a wonderfully talented team. I'm not going to promise anything, but there might be some interesting ways that we can graphically portray this, even beyond the good work they've done thus far. No promises yet, but we'll look into it.
No, sounds great. And I know some of the communications team is on the call as well.
They are.
If I can jump in for 1 second.
Go ahead.
Just also to add, there's the full technical report. There's of course this presentation, but we are putting together an executive summary, which is just a 2-pager leave behind sort of document that really is focused more on top level takeaways. But this conversation has been very helpful because you're right. You get very into the numbers and then we're trying to back out and think about how is this understood by a wide variety of audiences. And so definitely appreciate all the insight you have on kind of ways to make this more tangible to audiences, especially outside of Northern Virginia.
And I just wanted to add my thanks a little bit. It might seem like we're criticizing it. We're not, because we can't do all of this stuff to communicate unless there's actually something to communicate. So thank you. And we're all just leaping ahead to what our problem is. And it isn't like your guys are great. Next problem is how to make people see it who don't like to see this, don't want to see it. They don't want to see it. That's the first thing, right? And then and they don't want to do report, so it's a real communications issue. So I'm looking forward to what our communications team can do, because it's really good so far, but I think we got a tough audience coming up. Thank you.
Sure. Mayor Reed.
One final thought on this. There's a wonderful book called Made to Stick that was written in 2005, 2006 by Chip and Dan Heath. I love that book. And back when I used to teach people how to use social media, I would always go back and say, it's not the tools and it's not the platforms, it's the message. If you don't have a message that sticks, you don't have anything. Anyway, one of the concepts in there is something they call the gap of knowledge. And it's the hurdle that is created when we can no longer remember what it's like not to know what we know now. So people in Northern Virginia talk about transit and transportation because we live this. Like we talk about it in the bridges and the connection. We know this. But for people who don't know this, we no longer understand how to communicate with people who don't know what we know, because we no longer remember what it's like not to know what we know now. And so I think if you think about messaging, there is this gap of knowledge between Northern Virginia and the rest of Virginia because we don't remember what it's like not to know or live this every day. And we're trying to communicate something impactful and memorable and that will stick with them about the importance of this. I think that's a real challenge. It really is. So I don't envy the communications team. This is a big job. And I will echo everyone else's appreciation for what you've done here in putting this together. We just need to make it impactful for people who don't live this.
Maybe we need to make sure that those that ride the metro to get to dinner miss dinner that ride the cars miss dinner because of traffic accident.
Yeah, food for thought. Haha. Well, thank you, Ms. McGrain, again. As you can see, lively conversation. It should be interesting once we have the full commission to be able to hear all of this and to provide some feedback as well. And just as a reminder to all our commissioners present now, this will be at the June 1st meeting. We will take action on it. So thank you again, Ms. McGrain. And without protest, I'll go ahead and move us on to our next item, which will be the overview of MVTC's Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group. So we'll be hearing from our Senior Program Manager, Mr. Andrew DeVetter, who will present an overview of the Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group. It is a mouthful. It takes me a few times to say it, but it is okay because it is very important. This effort is intended to provide an analytical backbone to any discussions of revenue that may come up this fall and into the next General Assembly session. So, Mr. DeVetter, I will throw this over to you.
All right. Thank you, Chair Aguirre. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So as what started through the NVTC WMATA committee last year, and I think as commissioners have heard in discussions with Metro board members at various commission meetings, there is a fiscal challenge, an operating fiscal challenge is coming to Metro. And in our annual report on Metro last year, we talked about having to come up with a new operating model and perhaps to set up a staff working group to report back to the commission on some potential solutions. And so here we are. Next slide, please. So the staff level work is underway, but before I jump into that, I do want to do some very, very high level sort of Metro funding 101. And so we're here to talk about operating. Capital was more or less solved with additional federal funds and the 2018 dedicated capital funding, but we're here to talk about Metro's operating budget because that is where the challenge currently lies. The figure on the right is a stacked bar chart of Metro's revenue sources for the fiscal 24 budget that was just approved. And remember, in this, Metro is all three modes. It's rail, bus, and access. And the main thing here is to look at the very top, which is the federal funding. That's the COVID aid. This is the last bit of aid, so to speak. It'll be exhausted in this budget. And so its departure is a significant portion of the looming gap that is on a few slides from now. On the bottom is in blue are fare and non-fare revenues. And so this is just, passenger fares for bus and rail and some other non-fare sources. These are increasing as ridership recovers, but it's very much below pre-pandemic levels. The commuting trip patterns have changed, and so this is tremendously challenged by telework and other factors. And then the green is what we are all familiar with as jurisdictions that pay the bills in Virginia, and that is the jurisdictional operating subsidies. And so in Virginia, we have the breakout for the 6 cities and counties on the right. And the one constraint to this, of course, is that both Maryland and Virginia have legislative caps on how much that can grow. And so as that is constrained and revenues are down, we will have a gap. Next slide, please. So speaking of how DC, Maryland, and Virginia fund Metro, one key point is that Metro does not have any dedicated source of operating revenue, and everybody does it differently. That's the second key point. And so there are some interesting cases in Virginia and DC where certain funds are designated for use via legislation to then pay the subsidy. So it's a tool. And in Virginia, that is the regional gas tax and state aid, which NVTC holds in trust. And then local governments make payments from a variety of sources, but mostly from their general fund. Maryland is a bit different. The 2 counties' obligations are funded by the state. It just comes out of the statewide trust fund. And for the District of Columbia, it is simple in that it is one entity, but they also have some designated funds that they used to pay for Metro, and that is parking meter revenue and taxes on revenues generated from parking. And at our last Wilmette committee meeting, Chair Gary, you asked for some numbers here, and I was able to get them. And so at least in the mayor's proposed budget, the parking meter revenue was about 34 million, and the tax on parking lots and structures was about 73 million. And that could change as the council is finalizing the budget as we speak. Next slide, please. I am not going to go over every single flow in this chart. I do want to convey that this is actually a simplified version of how complex this funding flow is within Virginia. But in the operating world, there's really 3 things to think about. There's the state aid that we get from the Commonwealth. That's held in trust at NVTC, so the green box. There's the regional gas tax revenues that we hold in trust. A portion of it is able to be used for subsidies. NVTC makes payments at the direction of our jurisdictions, and then the jurisdictions themselves foot the bill using a variety of sources, mostly general fund, and in some cases NVTA 30% funds. So it takes a rather large village in Virginia to pay for Metro, and there is a lot of complexity to how the funding flows on the Virginia side. Next slide. So the cliff, so to speak, the operating budget gap. This figure is from the fall. We're expecting that Metro will have a lot more information in the coming weeks and months as they update this and really go out there with a lot of information on the fiscal cliff. But as I mentioned previously, subsidies are constrained, fare revenues are down. Even if the fare revenues were at pre-pandemic levels, there's still a gap. And so the numbers that we're looking at for fiscal 25 are about 738 million as a gap. And that's really with the federal aid being exhausted. There isn't really a way, the federal aid really is a cliff. So the next budget is when we're going to have to solve this challenge. And then there are, it obviously gets larger in the long term. One other key point to convey here is that there's a variety of structural factors at play that were at play before the pandemic, and the pandemic really accelerated them. And then the federal aid was able to give us a many-year stopgap, but we have arrived sort of at this point faster than one would have anticipated. And so there is an opportunity to try and solve it. Next slide. So what are we going to do about it? Right now, we've just started. We've started this working with the staff level operating funding and reform working group, and we have consultant support from Kimberly Horn and HDR. There's 2 words in the title are important. It is mostly about funding, but it is also about the reform piece. So what conditions and or strings may we want to ask for in exchange for funding. But going back to the revenue piece, we anticipate that this process will fit into a larger metro and or regional process whereby DC, Maryland, Virginia come up with what is the target, what are we trying to solve for, what is Virginia's share of that, and then we want to look at revenue sources, revenue structure, and then policy. And so in talking about revenue sources, the working group at a technical level is going to look at a large variety of sources, really hone those down based on what's stable and sustainable in the long term. What amount could those generate? What's the long-term growth potential and stability? And then, of course, what's the administrative and political viability of each of these options? Next slide. So that was sources. This is structure. And so we'll develop a menu of revenue options. And then there's another layer of questions about, okay, well, how, where does it go? But also what are we doing with it? So questions that the working group is going to be tasked to answer are, is our goal to meet that gap or exceed it? Options for exceeding could include lowering the traditional operating subsidy, but also taking a bigger picture at Metro as one of many transit providers in Northern Virginia. And so is this perhaps for transit operating overall? Within the Metro space, what modes are we funding? And then in what way? Is this regionally approached? Is it individually approached? Is it some sort of combination? And then who would hold the revenue in trust? Next slide, please. This effort is informed by previous staff research. So last fall to the WMATA committee, we provided a research on peer transit agency funding. This slide is one of the takeaways, and in blue, you see the dedicated operating revenues. And so one of the main points here is WMATA is the only one without, but WMATA is also the only transit agency that is a three-party interstate compact. So there's a lot of complexity and uniqueness to this arrangement. And then even though other agencies do have dedicated operating revenues, this fiscal cliff is not WMATA's fiscal cliff alone. The big agencies all are seeing this problem as they're all largely subject to the same trends. And so it is going to be a nationwide issue that everyone will have to solve. Next slide. This is a summary table that links to the previous slide, but the main point here is, or there are 2 points. One, New York is incredibly complex. So New York MTA has a very, very wide array of revenue sources, which we have listed here. I'm not going to go through them all. They're also the largest transit agency by far in the United States. The second is that most agencies have a sales tax. That is just what we found in the literature. And then some of the sort of mid-tier agencies may have one or more revenue sources. And so this list of sources will help inform our work. We're casting a wide net, as I mentioned previously. I think as we move towards, why don't you go to the next slide, please? Right. So to sort of wrap up before I go to questions, I do want to briefly cover next steps for the working group. So we have gotten started. We'll have a series of meetings at a staff level over the summer and into the fall. Our policy guidance for the staff level working group is this committee, the Legislative and Policy Committee, and it's the WMATA committee. So we'll have periodic check-ins over the year with those two committees. As we move into the fall, we anticipate that the final product of this working group would be a report to the commission. It would be a menu of revenue options and then some structure and policy recommendations as well. And that product would help inform the Legislative and Policy Committee's development of a legislative and policy agenda in the fall. So I will go ahead and turn it back to the chair for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Duvetter. And just to preface things a little bit with something that Andrew said a little bit earlier, I had asked at the WMATA committee meeting that we get a similar chart that we have for Virginia for where the revenue sources are coming from. And while the charts will probably be much less complicated, as in maybe just one arrow, it's good to know where exactly these sources are coming from, because it's not to say that it's easy for the other jurisdictions to be able to get this money, right? Let's say in DC, for whatever reason, all of a sudden parking tickets plummet and they're not getting that revenue, right? So we have to be cognizant of that, and that's an impact that they're having. Same thing in Maryland if they're having issues with generating revenue. But I think, if we're going to have this conversation as a region, then all of us need to have an understanding of what our revenue systems look like, what's impacting them, what's a good thing, what's a bad thing, and how we're working together to try and bring this to fruition as a system for WMATA. So just want to kind of throw that out there. But any questions from the rest of the commissioners? Mr. Snyder, please.
Sure, thanks. So I made this comment before and I'll make it again. We need a broader view of potential revenue sources, because that chart just listed taxes. And is it a sales tax, or is it this tax, or is it that tax? And I want us to look at privatization options, either in whole or in part. And if we don't do that, somebody is going to ask us, and we're just going to have empty hands. We went immediately to taxes. And in some quarters, that's a real credibility issue. So I'll make the point again, as I did in the WMATA committee, that if we're limiting our look to just tax revenue and not looking at various options of privatization, I don't think we're doing our job. So I want to make that point about as clearly as I can, number one. And it may be a mix of things. I mean, I don't know. And by privatization, I don't mean selling more advertising on the side of buses. I mean, seriously looking at the value of this to the private sector, what elements of it. And one other point, and I'll be not diplomatic about this, I think we almost need a control board type mentality. You have a situation that's running a huge deficit. What do you need to do to fix it? Rather than just simply continuing to pay into the deficit. What do you really need to do to fix it? So I'm deliberately using loaded terms to make the point that I hope that we're really looking at options, at least at the beginning. And we're bringing in the expertise beyond government people, beyond staffers that can bring that expertise to bear. Just a few suggestions anyway. But otherwise, thanks for the work.
No, point well taken, Mr. Snyder, because there are definitely folks that will bring that up for sure. So I think we need to be prepared to address that as well. Any other commissioners, any comments or anything? Thoughts? Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, thank you. So my first thought every time I listen to these presentations is, oh my God, what are we going to do? Because Dave brings up a really good point. I totally agree. We've got to be looking at those things. I mean, I think what I've heard is that nowhere else in the world do they expect transit systems to pay for themselves. I mean, I think, we have this American thing that we've got to be able to pay for it. I think we go to private industry, they're not going to take it up. They're not going to want to take it on because they can't make bucks on it. And then it gets to what's the work of government and all kind. I mean, it's really hard because I think it's un-American to have a lot of government supports and tax supports for a system that helps everybody. Unfortunately, it's un-American. But I don't know that you can run transit without doing that. And that's where I come. I mean, greater minds than mine can come up with something, but I just don't know what actually to sort of do. And maybe it's to just simply be honest about some things. But I think we're heading up to a really tough point because nobody wants to talk about privatization. I don't think will work. If it worked, fine, but I don't think it would. Because you couldn't make a profit. And then government subsidy, nobody wants to do it because it's un-American, but I don't know that we can do it or else we don't do it. I'm not, is there another choice? Subsidy, privatization, or complete failure? Is there a fourth way? I don't know.
Well, if we get the feds to
that's not the least bit helpful, but there you go.
Yeah, I would say if we just get the feds to print out some money for us, it'd be okay. Anyone else? All right. Well, Mr. DeVetter, I know you got your hands full. I really appreciate it. We'll be looking for the solutions to everything at our next meeting. Agenda item number 4, we've kind of already covered. We were kind of talking about strategies for the legislative session next year. I feel like we've kind of covered this. Ms. Matthijs, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just probably mostly thank you for all this input because all of the messaging, whether it's directly from our report or otherwise, is exactly what we're working on right now. Mr. Snyder, our consultants, we're charging them with everything under the sun in term, including private investment. So we're hoping to get some feedback. They're much smarter in this space and very well educated. So we want to provide some meaningful response to that. So I wanted to let you know with that. I think really for the big picture, we're going to need all of your help. And both in guiding what you want us to be doing, as well as, finding ways that you can be speaking with your colleagues, just so you know, all of the things that you're being presented with today, in particular with a bigger focus on the economic value study. As we bring this to the commission, I am socializing this with our broad business partner networks and other networks. So there is a Metro Now coalition. There are business chambers throughout Northern Virginia as well as the Commonwealth. There's a number of folks who are very interested and have asked me actually to provide that information. So it's sort of forthcoming. So I want to let you know, there's actually a lot of conversations, especially with the business community, because just like what happened in 2018, they are likely to be the ones to be really pushing the story and the need. And of course, we're not doing this by ourselves. This is something that we're working with WMATA on as well. They're going to be a big part of telling us exactly what's needed. We're going to be a part of saying what kind of reforms, et cetera, et cetera. So that's happening. The other thing that's going on with this is indeed, we are working with the WMATA committee on our annual report on WMATA. That includes in it NVTC's priorities for managing and controlling costs. So we see the efforts of the WMATA committee really working very closely right now with the Legislative and Policy Committee. Some of those things are going to be directed at WMATA. Other things may find them into legislative asks. So those things are happening right now. And finally, as I mentioned before, new legislator education. We're in a tough spot right now. We've got, there's June primaries. Some of that's going to change the dynamics. November elections are also definitely going to be changing the dynamics of the General Assembly. So we're obviously watching very closely as how to do that. But those education of the newly elected and new in leadership that may not be from Northern Virginia is something that Amy and I are closely aligning on. So we plan on doing that. And then finally, we do not have a date for our next Legislative and Policy Committee meeting. My anticipation would probably be later in the summer. I always want to be very mindful of summertime. That's like precious time for all of you. So I'll work very closely with the chair to do something that works well and also works strategically, as we really will be ramping up in the fall. So that is what I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Matthijs. Any questions? Because that's basically all we have for today. We did have a fifth agenda item, but it's basically just a grab bag in case anyone had any burning issues they wanted to bring up. As Ms. Matthijs said, we don't have our next date scheduled for the Legislative Committee meeting, but as soon as we figure one out, we will be sure to inform everyone. Ms. Garvey, do you have anything? Yeah.
No, I'm just thank you, everybody. This is plenty. I've already strained my brain. I mean, these are big, huge issues to try to figure out how to deal with. So,
hey, and we're gonna figure them out here first in the Ledge Committee. All right. Well, if there's nothing else for the good of the order, then I think I'll go ahead and adjourn us. Thank you, everyone. Be on the lookout for our next meeting, and take care.
Thank you. Everybody stay well. Thanks a lot.